Good morning.
Good morning.
And welcome again to all. I am Lindsay Bates. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'm visiting with you this morning because Reverend Denise very generously did not wish to share her decidedly unpleasant germs with all of you. Be very grateful to Reverend Denise. She is badly under the weather. There will be some changes from this morning's original plans and script. You'll notice that as we go through the service. But some things are important enough to keep the same. The flaming chalice is the symbol of our larger Unitarian Universalist community, our shared values, our deepest faith. And as the congregation's chalice is lighted, it is good to remember that many hundreds of other chalices are being lighted across the continent. We are a large community. All right.
Today we share the words of our chalice lighting. Our wisdom suggests two things. First, the key to living in liminal time or any time is balance. Second, we all have exactly what we need to spark and that balance. May the light within you guide your way. If you could rise to recite the words of our covenant. We unite to strengthen the bonds of kinship among all persons, to promote human dignity and increase reverence through life's creating, sustaining, and transforming power through worship, study, and service. Thank you. If you can please join us in hymn 300.
I understand we invite our young people to come up to the front for the For All Ages. So if you are young in fact, in spirit, come on up to the front, and if you prefer not to, that's okay too. I have nothing contagious and I do not bite. How many of you know what this is a picture of? Any of you? Do you remember seeing it before? It's been hanging in Atherton Hall, so it's been with you for quite some time. It is a picture of a man named Augustus Conant, and it's a tiny picture of him on his horse, riding away from a church, which you may not recognize either, because this church building is the church, the Unitarian Church in Geneva, Illinois, which is where I used to be the minister. Why it is hanging in your Atherton Hall, I have never fully understood. Yes.
I thought it was flowers because the flowers are the big
flowers are beautiful, and the flowers are the main point of the picture, but that little bit of extra.
He's a tiny little orphan heading for the giant flowers. It's kind of like the flowers are trees, and he's a tiny little orphan.
He's just kind of a little focus point for interest in the picture. You're right, the flowers are the most important part.
The flowers are front, and then the little man is in the back.
Yep. But I've got a story for you about that little man hiding in the back there in that picture. It is a true story. Augustus Conant was the first minister of the Unitarian Church in Geneva, and that's why his picture comes with a picture of the Geneva Church way back in 1842, which is a long time ago. None of us remember that, although some of us may have days of thinking we do. How many of you have ever heard of Augustus Conant? A handful. How many of you noticed the picture hanging in Atherton Hall? Who would notice that it's not there today, that it's moved out here? Well, this is a true story from Conant's army days. He was a chaplain during the Civil War, which meant that he was a minister to the troops, and he was also part of the medical team. He worked in the field hospital. His unit was in Alabama, and President Lincoln had not yet issued the proclamation that would free all the enslaved men and women and children. There were a lot of enslaved people in Alabama. Some of them ran away to hide in the Union camps, thinking that they would be protected there, and maybe they would even be able to fight, and they were mostly made welcome. But sometimes, unfortunately, the officers and soldiers in those camps would take bribes from people who were hunting runaway slaves, and would let them find the runaways in camp and take them back into slavery. And this made Augustus very angry. He had made a friend, a young African boy whose name was Andy. And Andy had come to the camp for safety, and Conant hired him to be his cook and to keep his tent neat, what's called a batman, not the kind with the ears. Conant also taught Andy how to read and write, which was, at that time, not allowed for people who were enslaved. But Andy was a really fast learner. And just parenthetically, Conant knew that Andy had a wife named Sally, who sometimes met Andy secretly at the well outside the Army's camp. But Conant never asked Andy any questions that Andy did not want to answer. Well, one very hot summer day, two ladies drove into the camp in a fancy carriage. They were looking for a runaway they said belonged to them, a man named Andrew. They had heard that he was in this camp, and they had a permit signed by General Rousseau, who was a big deal, to search for him. Augustus Conant closed his tent door and stood in front of it and told them that it was his tent and they were not going to go inside. They were not even going to look inside. They said, General Rousseau says that we may, and Conant said very politely, neither you nor the general may come into my tent. And the ladies were very angry because they weren't used to people saying no to them. And they left, promising to return with General Rousseau himself, and they would go into Conant's tent, and they would recapture Andrew, and Chaplain Conant would be very, very sorry. Well, after they left, Andy came out of the tent and said that he thought maybe he'd go take a walk. And Conant very carefully did not notice which way Andy went. 3 days later, guess what happened? The ladies came back. They didn't come back with General Rousseau, but they did come back with 3 soldiers who had orders to take Andrew, dead or alive, to the army headquarters. Well, Conant raced to his tent ahead of them, pulled the flaps closed, stood in front of the door. And one of the soldiers approached, and Conant said, "Get back." The soldier presented the search permit. Conant looked it over and said, "This permit says you can search the camp. It does not say you can search the chaplain's tent, and therefore you could not enter my tent." One of the women shouted that she wished she were a man because she would go into that tent. And the Reverend Mr. Conant very politely said it was a pity she was not, so she could try. Now, Conant knew that Andy was not in the tent. Remember that walk Andy went off on? He never came back from it. Much too sensible to come back. So why wouldn't Conant let the women and the soldiers into the tent?
So he could get a good laugh out of them.
He did get a good laugh out of them, but that wasn't his real reason for not letting them in. Why do you think he was? So they wouldn't go looking for Andy elsewhere, and because they certainly thought Andy was in the tent, but Andy wasn't in the tent. Do you think Augustus Conant did the right thing in refusing to let them in?
Yes.
I think so too. I think he was very brave.
Because then they would have found clues to where he went.
And you didn't want to find any clues. So Andy was safe, and no one dared go into the chaplain's tent. Ever. Not without the chaplain's specific invitation. And he didn't offer it very often.
Not even today.
Not even today. So thank you for being here to hear my story. And I believe that we sing you out now so that you can take your chalice light and go to your classrooms. I invite you to join in the spirit now of meditation and prayer. The words are in your order of service if you'd like to follow along. May you recognize in your life the presence, power, and light of your soul. May you realize that you are never alone, that your soul in its brightness and belonging connects you intimately with the rhythm of the universe. May you have respect for your individuality and difference. May you realize that the shape of your soul is unique, that you have a special destiny here, that behind the facade of your life there is something beautiful and eternal happening. May you learn to see yourself with the same delight, pride, and expectation with which God sees you in every moment. Amen. So I have lost my order of service. Do I now get to do my readings? The readings are next. It's a different order of service from what I'm used to, so my apologies if I get things out of order. The readings are all from the Reverend Augustus Conant. We have a lot of his written material available to us, and we use it all. Thank you very much, Tom. That will help. In 1851, Augustus Conant wrote a description of Geneva in the years before the Unitarian Church was established. A Methodist minister had sometimes preached here, but for want of encouragement had abandoned the place. There had also been Episcopal and Presbyterian and Baptist preaching, and I was informed there had been as many as 10 unsuccessful attempts made by ministers of one religious denomination or another to sustain worship or establish a society in the place. The moral and religious reputation of the village was low. Intemperance, profanity, and disregard for the Sabbath were characteristic of Geneva in 1841. From a letter published in the Unitarian newspaper, the Christian Register, in March of 1843, a letter from Augustus Conant to the wider Unitarian community seeking financial assistance in the building of the church. Our number is small. Less than 40 names are attached to our declaration, and the number of efficient members is less than 30. Feeble as we are ready to put forth what strength we have, and we believe the principles we have adopted are mighty and need only a fair opportunity to secure a glorious triumph. We are at present suffering great inconvenience for want of a suitable place in which to hold meetings. The courthouse in which we held meetings in summer is out of repair and without a stove. During the present winter, we have sometimes held our meetings on the Sabbath in a private house, and at other times in a small room erected for a grocery or storeroom for ardent spirits, but now occupied during the week as a schoolroom. The room, though so dark as to be very inconvenient, is very open, the walls plastered only in part, loose boards overhead, and wide cracks in the floor, admitting the strong and abominable odor of alcohol from the cellar, and the cold air from every side without. In addition to other discomforts, the smoke has forced tears other than those of emotion from our eyes, and I have sometimes shivered with the cold to such a degree that distinct articulation was almost impossible. And finally, our covenant, written in 1842 by Augustus Conant for the Geneva congregation. Being desirous of promoting practical godliness in the world, and of aiding each other in our moral and religious improvement, we have associated ourselves together, not as agreeing in opinion, not as having attained universal truth in belief or perfection in character, but as seekers after truth and goodness. In 1884, in order to make non-believers, non-theists welcome, the word godliness was changed to goodness. And with only that one very minor change, these words have been Geneva's bond of union for more than 180 years. Okay, so to repeat, no, I am obviously not Reverend Denise. As noted, she is down with a bug and not able to be with you this morning. She realized that she had no voice for preaching yesterday when she called my spouse, Scott Giles, and me to ask if either one of us might have a sermon in the barrel that we could quickly put together and bring to you. So this is not the sermon you were planning to hear this morning. I expect she will share it with you some future Sunday. Scott was wrapped up in writing the keynote address for an upcoming hypnosis conference, so you get me. Lucky you. Well, we'll see if we can take care of that, but thank you very much for making me so welcome. As many of you know, I am now Minister Emerita of the Unitarian Universalist Society in Geneva, where I served as senior minister for 40 years, which I only occasionally think of as wandering in the wilderness. I retired almost 5 years ago, and for those of you looking forward to retirement, I do commend it highly. But I'm still very much connected to Geneva. It will always be my home church, and its story continues to be a part of who I am. So what I bring to you today is part of that story. Some of you may remember that I came to Palatine in 2011 to share with you the life of the Reverend Augustus Conant, founding minister of the Geneva congregation, because Conant is at least a peripheral part of your story as well. Quite peripheral. You have, usually hanging in Atherton Hall, this painting of Augustus Conant on horseback, riding away from the Geneva church building, a gift from Martha Atherton of blessed memory. Marty and Bob had been married in the Geneva church and always felt a great fondness for Geneva, and I never understood why she gave the Augustus painting to Countryside. The flowers indeed are the main focal point for the painting and are indeed beautiful, but it never belonged in Atherton Hall. And for years I threatened Rupert and later Hillary that I would squeeze into my old leather catsuit, break in through a skylight, remove the painting from Atherton Hall and deliver it to Geneva where it belonged. Marty finally gave up and had the artist make a copy of the original, which she presented to Geneva, and I could permanently retire the catsuit. Conant's spirit is very much alive and central to who the Geneva Unitarian Universalists are as a congregation. And we're not the only ones who remember him. He's buried in the old Geneva Town Cemetery, and every Memorial Day when the American Legion conducts its services and reads the list of Geneva's Civil War dead, the Reverend Augustus Hammond Conant is on that list. The Elgin congregation remembers him as their first minister. Rockford remembers his brief time with them. The Chicago Historical Society has most of Conant's papers, and Civil War buffs are well aware of the importance of chaplains during that conflict, and some had even heard about Augustus Conant in particular. We talk about Augustus fairly often at UUSG. His portrait, painted when he was in his 20s, hangs in our heritage parlor, and we joke about how he haunts the sanctuary and is the spirit of the place, taking care of all who enter to worship. We remember how devout a temperance man he was, and so we know he would not approve of some of our congregation's parties. He kept a journal, he wrote reams of letters that his family held on to, so we know quite a bit about him, more in fact than we know about any of his successors until the 20th century. We don't cherish his memory because of his brilliant preaching or his imposing stature or his public influence. We cherish it because we know of his simple, deep humanity and because of the witness to courage, integrity, and faith that was his life. Augustus Hammond Conant was born on October 16, 1811 in Vermont into an old Yankee family of devout Baptists. His father, Eben, was a farmer, and Augustus got his schooling when farm duties permitted. Conant's grandfather, Ebenezer, was a lay theologian, deeply interested in matters of religion. Religion was a common household topic of conversation and one which Augustus took with great seriousness. Augustus wanted to go to college and enter a profession, perhaps even ministry, but his father disapproved. Conant's friend and biographer, the Reverend Robert Collier, commented that Eben thought there were too many professional men already. He feared also that a course of study would unfit his son for the active duties of life. He preferred also that Augustus should be a farmer, and so at last it was settled that a farmer he should be. And Augustus was reasonably content to be a farmer, but farming the rocky fields of Vermont was not the most rewarding of pastimes, and he listened longingly to the stories of clear, rich soil of the far west, in lands with exotic names like Illinois. In 1832, he decided to go west and see for himself if it really was everything he'd been told about. And except for one thing, it was. That one deep scar on the beauty of the lands he traveled through was the reality of slavery. While traveling aboard a steamboat on the Ohio River, Conant saw one of the crew, a freeman, seized by slave hunters who claimed that the man was a runaway slave, in spite of the fact that this crewman had all the necessary papers to prove his free status. Conant noted in his journal that had the ship's captain not gone with the man to the magistrate to speak on his behalf, everyone on board was sure the man would have been taken down the river and sold back into slavery. For Conant, this was a life-changing experience. He wrote in his diary, "I would not exchange the cold, rough hills of Vermont, uncontaminated as they are with the breath of slavery, for the finest country ever cultivated by the slave." And he became a fiercely committed abolitionist. The free territory of Illinois impressed him so greatly that he persuaded his entire family to pick up and leave Vermont and settle by the Des Plaines River in 1835. Young Augustus did indeed become a farmer in Illinois. He married 17-year-old Betsy Kelsey, who turned 18 the month after their wedding, and he became an activist for the causes of temperance and abolition. He made himself really unpopular in the village of Wheeling on the 4th of July, 1837, when, at the age of 27, he delivered a public oration denouncing the institution of slavery. He was shouted down and run out of town. His response was to take the text to Chicago to get it printed, and he plastered the various settlements west of Chicago with copies, thereby earning a reputation as both a troublemaker and a champion of the deepest ideals of freedom and community. That same summer, Augustus picked up a copy of James Freeman Clark's Unitarian paper, The Western Messenger, at the Clark's family store in Chicago, and he was deeply impressed. He ordered copies of back issues, subscribed to the journal itself, purchased and read the works of William Ellery Channing, one of the principal founding voices of American Unitarianism, and began attending Unitarian meetings and worship in Chicago. Conant also maintained his journal, and his journal for the weeks after his discovery of Unitarianism contains the following entries. "Meeting at my house, I read a sermon. Began to read the Western Messenger. Made a wagon. Made a cheese press. Unwell, so studied algebra. Attended meeting, read a sermon of Channing's. Went to the mill. Returned from the mill. Unwell, so wrote temperance address." I guess he never got all that very sick. Farming apparently left him plenty of free time, and he became a lay preacher, reading widely and liberal theology of the day, and writing sermons dealing with temperance, abolition, and the Unitarian faith in one God and a simple, practical Christianity. Among the places he visited was that small outpost of Geneva, where he encountered a group of transplanted New England Unitarians who were interested in establishing a church of their own in the wild frontier town. But they were true New Englanders, and they wanted a minister with a proper Harvard education to lead them. So Conant went off to Cambridge, Massachusetts to cram a 3-year ministry program into less than 1 year at Harvard. He began preaching regularly in Geneva in August of 1841, and he and his family moved to town in January of 1842. His journal entry for the day of the move states in its entirety, "Removed to Geneva, wrote a sermon, made a door." The journal goes on to record his activities of the next 2 weeks, and I read it to you in full to give you an idea of what his life was like. "Cut and drew ice and made curtain rods. Made a plan of a sermon on the prodigal son, a pair of quilting frames, and an argument at the Lyceum against capital punishment. Read meander, made a chair. Worked on a sermon and drew wood, snow 2 feet deep. Doctored sick horse. Cut wood, Red Meander, horse died. Red Bushnell, drew out manure. Wrote a sermon on episcopacy, built an ice house. Read the Methodist discipline, helped my wife to wash. Worked on a sermon, made benches for the school, finished the sermon, made soap. Getting the society started took a lot of time and hard work. Even though it had been the Geneva Unitarians who had sent Conant off to Harvard, it still wasn't until May of 1842 that there was any sort of official organizational meeting. And at that meeting, those 20 or so who were present weren't entirely sure that the time was really right for setting up the church after all. But a month later, on June 12, 1842, with much pushing from Augustus, the group met again and officially established the first Christian congregation of Geneva. With the help of donations from other Unitarians across the country, the first basic block of the church building was built in 1843. It had to be expanded in 1855, much of the actual work being done by Augustus and his father Evan. Conant was definitely multi-talented. He also had an unlimited practical compassion, and he was always sharing his own skills and possessions with others. When he first came to Geneva with his wife and family, before they were able to build their own home, they rented 2 rooms in a Mrs. Harrington's house. Shortly after moving in, Conant encountered a destitute, homeless family, husband, wife, and child. And the 4 Conants, with a 5th on the way, gave up one of their 2 rooms to this family. Whenever Augustus came into possession of something of value, high-quality cloth for a coat, for example, he would send half of it off to someone else who had need of it, or sell it, and then have twice as much to share. Physically, he was not particularly impressive. He did not scare the people when he stood at his tent door. He was about as tall as I am, barely 5'1", with a stretch. And when he first visited Geneva as an itinerant preacher, the general impression was that he was one of the farm boys sent into town for supplies. The Reverend Robert Collier wrote that he was quaintly dressed, they say, and did not promise much at first glance. I suppose he was not a bit like Dr. Lowell, the Unitarian preacher they'd left behind in Boston. But when he had once preached to them, they felt it was all right, recognized the fine soul under the queer garb, made him welcome with all their hearts, and invited him to come again. Conant was, said another, a quaint figure from which spoke a great soul. By all reports, Conant was, in fact, a rather good preacher. Well, he had to be the whole people's attention. His style would not be well received today, I suspect. He kept his nose right in his manuscript. He tended to be a bit fidgety, and he had a facial tic that seems to have been more noticeable when he was preaching than when he was in conversation with someone. But as one Genevan noted, no matter if the first impression was unfavorable, he soon swept that away by his zeal, his genuineness, his self-forgetfulness. Augustus's ministry in Geneva was, all in all, a good one. People remembering him at the church's 50th anniversary celebrations in 1892 recall a man deeply involved in caring for his people, admired and respected by the community, loving of and much loved by the children of the church, even if he did handle discipline problems with his sons during the church services by making the boys sit at the foot of the pulpit where he could keep an eye on them. He served not only the Geneva church, but also a circuit of a dozen or so other churches on alternate weekends, preaching regularly at Elgin, Joliet, Rockford, Batavia, where he reported finding great prejudice against us, Sugar Grove, St. Charles, Warrenville, Naperville, Chicago, Aurora, Belvedere, and further on up into the Wisconsin territory. There was only one problem, and that was that issue of slavery. Conant was well before his time in his passionate abolitionist position. Except for Theodore Parker back in Boston, and Parker was considered something of a dangerous eccentric too, there was very little open opposition to slavery among Unitarians in the 1840s and 1850s. While few of the original Geneva congregation agreed with Conant on this, those who had been with him from the beginning tended to tolerate what they regarded as his anti-slavery rantings. The newer people coming into the church in the 1850s, however, seem not to have been quite so tolerant, especially since they, as merchants with economic ties to the institution of slavery, considered themselves to be under personal attack. The Reverend L.C. Kelsey, also a Unitarian minister in the area, described a Sunday when Conant had been preaching a sermon upon the terrible evil of human slavery as it then existed in our country, while in the midst of his most fervent utterances, a prominent member of the society took his hat and in an excited and unceremonious manner left the church. In the morning, Kelsey continues, Brother Conant, in referring to the incident, remarked to me that he did not notice any great change in the appearance of things. The sun arose as usual, the sky looked as bright and as beautiful as ever, and such little incidents, however unpleasant, could not hinder the onward march of truth and the ultimate triumph of the right. The divisions and the opposition did affect him, though, however calmly he seemed to take them. And rather than split the church, which was beginning to look very likely, Conant decided in the summer of 1857 to accept a call from the Unitarian congregation in Rockford. For 16 years he had served the Geneva Church, but as he wrote in his journal, it was a clear case of duty to leave them, and most fervently do I commend them to the favor of God. Conant spent about 4 years in Rockford, but he never seems to have been truly at home there. His ties were to Geneva, and the uprooting nearly broke his heart. In 1861, he resigned from Rockford to enlist as a chaplain with the 19th Illinois Regiment in the Army of the Union. His military career was not particularly smooth. There were frequent confrontations with the men he was trying to serve over the evils of strong drink. And because some of the Union soldiers and officers were not above returning an escaped slave or letting slave owners search the camps for runaways in return for monetary rewards, he was continually hiding runaways himself and daring anyone to search his tent for them. The fact that no one ever dared push through to search the chaplain's tent tells you a great deal about his force of character. He battled for improved living conditions and better health care for the men, and he had some success there. And he battled with itinerant preachers who wanted to come into the camps and preach hellfire and damnation to young men about to go off and die. Conant did not have a high opinion of these preachers, and in one letter home to Betsy, commented of one pious Orthodox sister that, "I hope in the Lord's good time he will take her to glory. I am sure I should much prefer that all such sisters should go to glory than come into the camp. I hardly know which is more annoying, Orthodox bigotry and cant, or infidel blasphemy and cursing. Both are bad enough. But the hope of doing some good still keeps me in heart." At the end of 1862, Conant's regiment wound up in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. The new year began with heavy fighting there, the Battle of Stone River, and Conant, working in the battlefield hospital, was everywhere, helping the wounded on both sides. His son Neroy was also stationed at Murfreesboro, and it was Neroy who wrote home at the end of January to tell his mother and sister how Conant had fallen ill. His disease, he wrote, is inflammation of the lungs, caught from overwork during the battle. I saw him a number of times as the battle went on and tried to persuade him not to do so much. But he said he could not bear to see wounded soldiers suffer when he could help them. Neroy wrote home hopefully of recovery, but by the 6th of February, Augustus himself told his son, "I shall not probably live, but I have no fear of death. I am ready and willing to go at any time God may call me, and but for the pain of the separation from you and the dear ones at home, I should have no wish to live. But the good Father who watches over us all will care for and protect you when I am gone." He suffered a relapse on the 7th, and on Sunday, the 8th of February, 1863, in the early afternoon, he died. Conant's body was returned to Geneva for burial. His old friend Robert Collier of Chicago's Second Unitarian Church delivered the funeral oration, and his infant son, Augustus Turchin, whom Conant never saw, was baptized on his coffin. Little Augustus lived only 2 years, and he is buried in the town cemetery next to his father. At the time of his death, Augustus Conant was not yet 52 years old. And I remember on my own 52nd birthday thinking, I wish I had a fraction of the guts, the courage, the willingness Augustus had to take on even those he most loved for the sake of a higher value that he knew in his deepest core of self was right and just and true. And Augustus Conant lives on in Geneva, in the town's history, in the stories we tell at Geneva, in the Geneva sanctuary, the physical place where his spirit still lives, where his spirit occasionally walks, they say, and his name is remembered. And he lives in the living faith of his religious descendants, who take the lessons of his life and his death to heart for ourselves. That, not as agreeing in opinion, holds our quite varied gatherings of Democrats, Republicans, Independents, Christians, Jews, Buddhists, Muslims, pagans, generic theists, atheists, agnostics, and the theologically confused, all together in one liberally religious community, working and playing and worshiping together in spite of our very real differences of opinion. The controversies on the battlefields of today are different, of course, but fierce conflicts obviously are still going on. And so long as there are any wounded and suffering, we know that we too cannot rest. If we die in the battle, well then we die. But we give our lives for a worthier cause, for justice, for those who are still seen as less, for those who are hurting, for those who are struggling to be seen as whole. We are one human family, one human community on one fragile planet. Augustus Conant knew that, and he lived his life for that knowledge. And we who are his heirs by history and by choice believe that as he did, so too must we. And here ends the sermon.
So we've got another brief change to the order of worship. Originally, we were going to have Kathy Millen here as a guest, and she couldn't make it today, so Mike Berry is going to, after the offertory, Mike is going to give some remarks about POC, so then we'll do the hymn after that. So as to the offering, what I got out of the reading this morning is 180 years ago in this area, Unitarians were saying to each other, our numbers are small, but our principles are strong, and we're going to move on and establish a home for religious freedom in this area. So here we are, still at it in 2023. Each week we take up an offering over and above member pledges. Your contribution supports the mission of Countryside, our presence in the community, the staff we hire to support that mission, and the building that houses our work. Your gift helps to maintain our church as the strong beacon of UU values in the northwest suburbs. So there's instructions as to how to give electronically in your order of worship on Zoom. It'll be on the screen, and we'll pass the basket here in the house. So the morning offering will now be received.
Good morning, everyone. My name, again, is Mike Berry, and I head up Countryside's Outreach Steering Committee. My pronouns are he and him. The OSC manages our relationships with our outside service partners. So our upcoming Time and Talent event will raise funds for both CCUU and our partners. And as the event approaches, we're going to try to offer you brief informational talks on these partners. And today is about partners in our communities. So POC is an organization that works in multiple ways to help both recent immigrants and some of the least resourced households in our area to, in short, envision and attain a better life. They provide under one roof food pantry and community closet, workforce training and education, English language instruction, access to wellness services and medical care, youth engagement that covers everything from childcare to violence prevention, a women's leadership program, and an employment program, and a community garden with related programs on planting, harvesting, cooking, nutrition, and kids' activities. It's a remarkable place. Spend even a brief time at POC, it's hard not to be inspired. There are plenty of volunteer opportunities, I should say, and they're about a mile from here on Rand Road. POC serves people from various places, and that includes our Chalice House residents from Colombia and Guatemala. I recently spent about an hour with a man who fled the war in Ukraine with his teenage daughter. He was a professor of economics in Ukraine, came here with next to nothing. It's very difficult for him to talk about the life and loved ones he left behind, as you can imagine. At POC, he's gaining English proficiency and looking to build a life here. While Time and Talent raises money for both us and our partners, part of the event is a raise the paddle for specific goals. For POC, there will be 2 paddle raises, one for a summer camp for kids. The 3-week session costs only $100, but that's an amount that's out of reach for many of POC's families. The other is for their women's leadership program to support employment, training, and job placement. These are both great vehicles to support families in need in our community, and I hope you'll join me in supporting them. And thanks very much for your attention this morning.
Please join me as you are willing and able to rise at hymn number 27, I Am That Great and Fiery Force.
As we end our time together and prepare to leave this sacred place, let us pledge our hearts to gratitude and to the service of life, not only that we may rejoice, but also that we may give comfort and gladness to others. Our worship has ended. Now let our service begin. Go and be peace.
We resist. every mountain